Two things. First, we've never talked to Stephen Schwartz. And the second thing is we have never talked about psychic archaeology, which is astonished me. In all the years I've been doing Dreamland, the subject's never come up. But it's going to come up today, and we're going on quite an extraordinary adventure into the world of psychic archaeology. But before we do that, I want to let you know a little bit about Stephen and his background. First of all, he is one of the most connected, best connected people in the world of remote viewing, and he's got a phenomenal course available. You can go to his website, StephanASchwartz.com. Stephen, have I got that correct?
That's right.
Stephan A. Schwartz, that's StephanASchwartz.com to get a look at this marvelous course. And I say marvelous because a number of people I know well, among them Dr. Hal Puthoff, are participants in this course. It's called the Gold Standard Course for a reason. Russell Targ is involved, Ingo Swan, all old friends, Skip Atwater, even Edgar Evans Casey is involved. It's 15 discs in 3 volumes. Tell us a little bit about it. Why don't you, Stephen, and let us know a little bit more about the course.
Well, I thought it had been almost 30 years since we had a small group of us had created remote viewing as a laboratory protocol. And in that time, it had gone from being this obscure lab protocol to a social movement. It was just amazing. I mean, we didn't anticipate any of that, but it's the first thing that has ever moved about consciousness that was testable, that you could objectively validate, and that most people could do. And so it has ballooned from a few hundred, a handful of people to a few hundred to now there's close to 1 million hits that come up if you do it with Google. So I thought it was time that those of us who had been involved in the creation of remote viewing got together and each spoke in the area that he had greatest expertise. And so I filmed them all, and it's like a PBS kind of program. And it's got 10 DVDs, which are Hal Puthoff talking about the CIA program, Russ Targ talking about quantum physics and consciousness. Ingo talks about what he's learned over the years, and James Spottiswoode talks about local sidereal time. Dale Graff talks about remote viewing and dreaming. Paul Smith talks about the Army experience. Skip talks about the Monroe work and remote viewing, and so you've got sort of the whole arc of the development of this whole area of research and human experience. And so I put it together and then put 5 CDs which take you through the actual experiences, so that it's a head and heart sort of thing. You get a chance to get the intellectual material, the science, and then you get to actually get the art and have the experience of these abilities.
Because it's actually, these are the people who actually did this. In other words, it's not, there's so much junk out there with remote viewing courses. I mean, it's a load of baloney.
That's what part of the reason I did it. This is, if you want to know what the CIA actually did in terms of the SRI, Stargate, all of that, there's nobody better than Hal Puthoff. He was the director of the lab when it was going on. If you want to know what's the real truth about local sidereal time and its effect on remote viewing performance or geomagnetic field strength, and there's nobody better than James Spottiswoode. He was the one who did the original research that led to understanding that. If you want to talk about the Army, Paul Smith was the commanding officer. I mean, you can't get better than that.
Yeah, the commanding officer, not some sergeant who happened to be there in the background.
Yeah, I mean, these are the actual guys, and they're talking about the stuff that they actually did. It's none of it is secondhand. I talk about the social role of it, and I also talk about the archaeological work that I did and over the years.
which is we're going to be talking about also later in the program. Now, you passed over something very quickly, James Spottiswood's research into sidereal time and its significance in regard to remote viewing. Let's talk a little bit more about that. That's a particularly fascinating subject because it's an important one that we know very little about.
Well, sidereal time is one of the influences that we know shape our ability to do this. This is a lawful ability. That is, it follows certain rules. We know, for instance, that meditation makes people better remote viewers, probably because it teaches them to focus. We also know that there are things in the biosphere, that is, changes in the environment of the planet that have an effect on all living organisms, and one of the effects is that it either improves or degrades remote viewing. We know that, for instance, when the geomagnetic field is weak and when things are quiet, that you do better than when it's not. We know that there are certain times when it is better to do a remote viewing than others. Although I want to emphasize, these are slight changes. It's kind of like doing an aspirin study. That is, you can't tell about a single person if they took aspirin whether it made any difference. But if you look at a lot of people, you can see over that course of people that although this effect is small, it is pronounced. And that's what happened. Local sidereal time, I can't even, because nobody has any idea what causes it. We just know that if you do remote viewings at sometimes rather than others, that you get a better outcome.
So getting into the course then, what is it, I've been looking at the course on Amazon.com, folks, by the way, and it gets fabulous reviews, so people are liking it, and I'm always interested in this because remote viewing is something that you can do. It's anyone can do it. That's correct, isn't it, essentially, Stephen?
That's correct.
Anyway.
Let me define answer your question about local sidereal time.
Define sidereal time for us, by the way. That would be a good idea.
The ordinary 24-hour solar day is slightly longer than the sidereal day. It's because the revolution of the Earth around the sun in the same direction as the daily rotation of the Earth. And the Earth it rotates a little bit more to bring the sun back overhead from one noon to the next. So there's a slight differential in these two times and the chronological time that we work with. And we know that if you where you are on the planet makes a difference about what the local sidereal time is. You can calculate it by going to websites that are maintained by the Navy. That you can just do a Google on local sidereal time. It's SIDEREAL, and you can work out. You don't have to do any calculations. All the math is. You don't need any of that. You just go. The Navy maintains a site, and you put in where you are located, and it will tell you what your local sidereal time is. And the reason it matters is that at 1350, at 1:30 local sidereal time, an experiment's 5 times as likely to be successful as at other times, and at 1800 hours, which is 6 o'clock, an experiment is least likely to succeed. So it matters at what time you do it, but as I say, it's a small effect, and lots of very successful remote viewings have been done with no consideration to this at all. But if you want to be in a sort of optimal state, you want to be a meditator, you want to be a person who's in good health, does regular physical exercise, because we know that good health is also one of the determinants. You want to do this at a particular time, as I say, at about 1:30 local sidereal time, and you want to do it when the geomagnetic field strength is weak and solar activity is low, and that will give you, from the point of view of the viewer, that'll give you the greatest opportunity that you'll be able to obtain information from the future or from distant locations.
Well, it's most interesting in any case, and I'm very glad to see that the course is available, because It is, and even in the reviews on Amazon, people mention how disappointed they've been in the past with these courses that don't work, and they simply don't work. I was very fortunate to be taught this in such a way that I've come to use it constantly in my everyday life, and I find myself using it so frequently. For example, if I drive around a lot in California and it's a lot of traffic, and I can easily remote view ahead to see what the traffic just is by just looking down at the highway. It becomes I know that sounds wild, but it's extremely effective, and it's never wrong. I never even think about it. It's just like seeing through my regular eyes at this point.
That's the point. This is a normal human ability.
Exactly.
You're not getting anything. You already have this. It's about learning how to open yourself to this level of this source of information. And once you've got it, it's just as you're saying, you do it. It's like second nature. Oh, I wonder what the traffic's going to be like 2 miles ahead. It's
exactly.
You just do it.
You do it, or in the case like right now, as I'm sitting here and I see Anne I'm in my studio. The door is closed. Anne is in the next room. She's sitting at a round table. I know the table well, of course. And she's reading a newspaper. And if I walk out there, I know that's exactly what I will see. And
okay.
So
you are one of those people who is already working with this aspect of himself.
Well, I've taken a course in remote viewing, a very good course, in fact. Not your course. It didn't exist then. This was about 10 years ago. And I use it in my everyday life. It's interesting that the things, if I feel challenged, in other words, if you were to say, well, tell me what I'm doing, what you're doing right now, where you are, and describe your room, I'm not so sure I would be able to do it. I use it, in other words, I don't feel I'm a psychic so much. I use it in everyday life, though. And
I think we need to give up all those words like psychic. They are all terribly emotionally freighted. What we're dealing with is non-local awareness. There's nothing paranormal about all of those words it's some sort of strange thing that's off to one side of human functioning. It isn't at all. If you look at the literature, for instance, of religious ecstasy, of the biographies of saints, or you look at the biographies or autobiographies of geniuses like Einstein or Mozart or Brahms or Beethoven, or you look at the kind of descriptions remote viewers give, you very easily see that all three of these people are reporting different variations of the same experience. They all report, all the senses are reporting, that is, you can taste, touch, smell. They all report that there's a sense of connection to a greater whole. They all report that the experience is kind of holographic. That is, it's like a daydream. You sort of see and know everything all at once. And whether you're having a moment of genius or composing a symphony, you're still opening up to this aspect of the self. And when you talk about how you use it in ways that are completely natural, and it's as ordinary to you as saying, oh, I can smell onions cooking on the stove. It's part of our normal functioning. And what remote viewing does is reawaken a discipline that allows you to open to this. And it does so in a way that's different than most New Age sort of things, which are couched in philosophical terms. I think one of the things that makes remote viewing attractive to a lot of people, particularly a lot of men, is that it's sort of like an engineering for the mind that allows you to touch this timeless aspect of the self. And you can do it in a way that can be independently verified. That is, if you describe something like Anne is out there reading the newspaper, well, that's either true or it's not true. And you can ascertain whether it's true. And once you do that, once you have this experience and it's validated to your own satisfaction, your whole point of view changes. Because then arguments about does this stuff exist, does it not exist, they don't mean anything anymore. You've had the experience. You know it exists. And whatever anybody tells you, you had the experience. It's there. And if you can do it again and again, it becomes very clear that you can do it. And it becomes normal, as it is with you.
Right, and to an extent, it's normal. If I try to do it, in other words, if I try to put myself under pressure, it really doesn't work. It's like trying to think about it when you ride a bike. You can ride it fine until you start thinking about balancing, and then you can't ride it anymore.
That's because your intellectual mind steps in and throws up all kinds of interior guards, they're like firewall programs on a computer that says, nope, you can't do this. No, wait a minute, this is irrational. How can you possibly do this? What part of you could, you have all of these rationalizations that are going on, plus you have performance anxiety. Just like anything else, if I suddenly said to you, okay, well, you've got to go out and play the violin, I don't know whether you play the violin, but you'd feel a certain amount of stress about that. Well, it's the same kind of thing, only, that would be bigger, but we have stress anxiety, and then we have a lot of what we call analytical overlay. We have all of this stuff going on in our analytical minds, and what we're trying to do is to allow the intuitive aspect of the mind to surface into consciousness.
Well, this is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back, and we're going to surface into consciousness in a big way in just a moment. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Stephen Schwartz. His book, The Secret Vaults of Time. His course, the golden, what is it again? The gold standard. The gold standard. That's right. The gold standard remote viewing course available from his website, StephanASchwartz.com. That's StephanASchwartz.com, StephanASchwartz.com. And you can get it there. We've been talking about it and talking about remote viewing just in general. And, I was always tremendously impressed with people like Joe McMoneagle, who I know a little bit. I've interviewed a few times on the radio program and met at the Monroe Institute at one point. How confident he is. He doesn't have any performance anxiety. He just does it.
Well, that's like Yo-Yo Ma. He doesn't have any, Joe is good at it because, like a good tennis player or a good skier or a good martial arts person, he does it regularly. He has a very specific discipline for doing it. He also has a very high aptitude for it. He has a lot of potential talent. There are two components to it. There's the potential ability, just like any other human ability. Some people are better at singing than other people. Some people are better at math than other people. You have aptitudes. So you have a natural aptitude, and then how that develops depends on the discipline that you develop to express it. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. Remote viewing is just one. You can learn a martial art. That'll get you to the same place. You won't have quite the same experience. Each of these pathways comes with its own set of experiences, but all of them are ways of opening up to this perfectly normal aspect of consciousness that allows you to move outside time-space. We know that with statistical accuracy that it is just as easy to describe something that is near as something that is very far. Ingo Swann and Harold Sherman went out into the space and described Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter before the space probes got there, and they provided evidence that was highly contradictory to what was known at the time, but was later validated by the space probes. That Jupiter had a ring, for instance. Whether it's far away or whether it's in the next room or whether it's just in a hidden box sitting a foot from you, you can get the same quality of information. We also know that it's possible, in archaeological digs I've done, people have gone back thousands of years. They describe it with exactly the same kind of detail that they would describe if I had hidden it, if I had hidden something in a hole 25 minutes earlier.
It's absolutely fascinating and amazing. And again, Dreamland is about empowerment. It's about actually doing stuff. We can do this. These are all things that are very, very doable. Now, I would like to turn to the book, to The Secret Vaults of Time. And the reason we're on the air talking about this book is that some of the psychic archaeology that was done in the past that this book covers is so convincing. Some of the psychic experiments also are so convincing that you come away from it empowered and realizing this is real. This is possible. And I want to begin at the beginning, really.
That's wonderful, by the way. That's exactly what I intended.
I know, and that's the value
I'm very
of this.
pleased that you...
Because we can all be much more than we've been taught. We are in the process in this civilization of being taught out of our humanity. We're being taught not to be human anymore. Being taught. And I am against that. I want to be fully human.
Right.
Fully human means that you are essentially always connected to the entire universe, and in a lot of remarkable and very extraordinary ways. You are, folks who are listening, every one of you is just as effective as the psychics we will be talking about. And as
absolutely.
Absolutely.
If remote viewing doesn't teach anything else, I've tested over 25,000 people, and I can tell you that it doesn't make a bit of difference what your social background is, what race you are, what religion you are, what gender you are. None of those things mean anything. We know that extroverts and introverts have slightly different strategies for getting to the same place. This is an ability that is spread through the population like any other ability. It's a bell curve. There's a few people at one end who are just extraordinary. And then there are most of us who fall somewhere in the middle. And then there are a few people at the other end who either cannot or will not give themselves permission to have the experience. But I don't know what any given individual will do, but I know that one of the reasons remote viewing has grown as it has is that most people have a successful first experience. And once you have the experience, you get it. So,
right.
It's easily accessible to anybody, and you're absolutely right. It's telling you something about yourself that's very important to know, and that there is not very much else in our culture that supports this idea that you really do have the ability to access information, and you also have, as we know from the therapeutic intent studies, the prayer studies, we know that the consciousness of one person can have a therapeutic effect on the well-being of another, or on other living organisms, or on plants, or in an experiment that I did, it can change the structure of water. We know that...
Now tell us a little bit about that.
The water experiment?
Yes, please.
Well, I did an experiment in which I had 14 people who were practitioners of one kind or another. That is, I had 7 naive people who had never done anything like this before, and I had 7 people who were practiced healers. And they were everything from channeling space people to evangelical Christianity. And I got them to do healing on 14 randomly assigned people. And, I was the head of a team. I was the principal investigator. And while they were doing this, they had little sealed bottles of water, of a very special, very pure kind of water, in these little sealed bottles that were held on their hands by a little tube of cotton. And they went ahead and they did healing, and there was a 5-minute bottle and a 10-minute bottle and a 15-minute bottle. And then we took a measurement called infrared spectrophotometry. It's just you shine an infrared light through a very thin film of water, and a certain amount of the energy gets absorbed, and it produces a kind of chart, a kind of graph that you can read, so you get a physical representation of it. And we looked at the treated bottles, that is, the bottles that had been exposed to healing, as compared to control bottles, that is, bottles that were made, the water was made at the same time and put into the little bottles, only these bottles had never been exposed to healing. I wanted to see if it was possible to get an objective measurement of healing that had nothing to do with the consciousness of either the healer, that is, that there wasn't going to be a placebo effect. There's a certain number of things, if you do something, and you have a treated population and a control population, that is people who don't get the treatment, there's a certain number of people in the control population who still get better. And that's just the way it is. And so I wanted to do an experiment in which that wasn't a factor, and so I used water. And the reason I used water is that it has been associated for most of human history with healing and rituals. And I thought, well, there's a reason that people do that. I mean, they've learned something over the millennia. And so we looked at the water and we measured it, the treateds versus the controls, and we found that all of the treateds, that there was an effect, that there was a change in the hydrogen-oxygen bonding. It's the way the molecules link up together. Right. And that there was a change in the water that was treated versus the control water. And we eliminated, could it be something that the spectroscopist, the person taking the measurement, was doing? Could it be heat? Could it be motion? I mean, could it be barometric pressure? Could it be everything you could think of? And when we eliminated every other possible explanation for the effect, we were still left with the effect, and therefore it had to be just the consciousness of the healer to express healing intention. And it validated the experiments that are being done where people are holding therapeutic intention, whether it's expressed in religious terms or whether it's just what's called therapeutic touch, where it's just sort of secular healing, I guess to call it.
And we're going to have to take a little break now, Stephen. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We are talking to Stephen Schwartz, his book, The Secret Vaults of Time, Psychic Archaeology and the Quest for Man's Beginnings. His course, the gold standard course in remote viewing, available from Stephan A. Schwartz.com. We were talking before we left the air about water and transformation of water into a healing substance. This is not difficult. And I'll tell you something else about water. You can increase your own psychic power with water. The same kind of intention that therapeutic intention that Stephen is talking about, you can really fill water with almost any kind of intention you seek, you want, and then bring the water into your body, drink it, and the intention will come with it. You can nourish your subtle body as well as your gross body, your physical body, with this water. So let's keep going, Stephen.
Okay. Well, we sort of took a left turn from the archaeology part.
Oh, that's okay. We're taking a lot of left and right turns. Why don't we do this? Why don't we focus? There's so much we could talk about, and so much I want my listeners to know from you, because you're one of these people out there who can help us empower ourselves and can change lives and maybe even change souls, so that in the future, when the people recur into new lives, they'll be more than they are now because of what they learned from you in this life. Let's talk specifically, and I'm going to about Glastonbury and Frederick Bligh Bond. Tell us first what this 19th century psychic archaeologist, the first really, what he did with regard to the Glastonbury ruin in England.
Well, Frederick Bligh Bond was what used to be called an antiquarian. It's a kind of, some of them are very expert. There tend to be people who focus on some particular thing and become very expert at it. And even if they may not have formal academic training, they just become very expert. And Bond was interested in Glastonbury Abbey, which was this extraordinary cathedral abbey. It was really like a town that had been the most powerful Christian shrine in England, in the British Isles. And it was more or less destroyed by Henry VIII when he broke away from the Roman Church. But in any case, it was this great center of culture and learning and wealth, and it was a very big deal. And on the tour, which is a large hill that was to the sort of one side of this abbey, was supposed to be a well where Joseph of Arimathea had struck the ground, and this well had come up, and it was sacred going all the way back to the Druids. So this was an important area, and this cathedral and abbey arose, and then it was destroyed and lost. And by Bleiband, by the 19th century, there wasn't very much left but a couple of walls. And there were great questions about what it had looked like and what this world had been like. And Frederick Bleiband had become an expert in church architecture. And he got the job as the director of excavations at Glastonbury Abbey. Glastonbury is in England. And he went out into the fields, and to the people who were observing him, he was like a miracle. No, miracle work is too strong. He was a kind of genius at knowing where to dig. He would go out into the field with his work crew and out in the middle of nowhere, and he'd say, "Dig here," and they would find something. And people marveled at that, and he was much lionized and made a great deal of, because he was gradually able to reconstruct the abbey, and particularly something called the Edgar Chapel, which was where was this particular chapel in this church, and the abbey grounds and all of that. He was able to reconstruct it to an extraordinary level of detail. So they made a huge fuss about him, and then he wrote a little book called Gates of Remembrance, in which he revealed that he had done this whole thing by using automatic writing, another kind of remote viewing, helped by a retired British Army officer, and that they ostensibly were being guided by the monks who had built the cathedral originally and who wanted it restored to its former glory, and they directed him where to go. And all of a sudden, he became an unperson. I mean, nobody wanted to know him. And if you go there today, the only mention of his name is on a model that they've got in this little museum. At one little tiny corner, about 1 inch by 2 inches, this little bitty label says, "Based on the reconstruction of Frederick Bleiband," or something like that. And
right.
That's the only mention of him. He ended up a broken man. He ended up working as a cleaning the artifacts that had been found when he had been the director of excavations. It's a very sad story, but it allowed the reconstruction of this tremendously important Christian and pre-Christian shrine, and it was all done by the monks. This is what he said, by the monks who guided him as to where to go, and they were very specific.
They were, and they even told him about things like the Edgar Chapel, which were not known at the time.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there isn't any question about this. They led him to this huge internment. He went out and dug this, wrapped in lead, this knight who was buried out along one side, and the monks told him who it was. They gave him all kinds of information, how long the nave was and where the buttresses were. And I mean, if you go there now, you can see the outline of all the excavations and all of the structural reconstruction that he did. It really was quite an amazing experience to see this. And one can only wonder what would have happened if he just kept his mouth shut. Right.
He would have become one of the great English archaeologists.
He'd be Sir Frederick today.
He would be, yeah.
Absolutely.
But bear this in mind, folks, and this is very important. This is why this book is so empowering, The Secret Vaults of Time. This man was working at a time when he could not have fudged this. In other words, there was no sonar, there was no ground-looking radar, there was nothing that would have enabled him to determine the positions of some of the artifacts and remains that he unearthed, including, in the case of the Edgar Chapel, there were no records of it. It had been lost.
Right.
And here he found it psychically and then unearthed it. Now, of course, because he had
It's lovely, isn't it?
It's lovely. Exactly. It's lovely. That's why I love the book. That's why I'm talking to you, because it's all lovely. It's quite a marvelous, and we're going to go into some more of these marvelous adventures in just a couple of minutes with Stephen Schwartz. This is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland. We're talking to Stephen Schwartz. His book, The Secret Vaults of Time, his course, The Gold Standard, Remote Viewing. You can get it from Stephan A. Schwartz. That's StephanAschwartz.com, or just go to Unknown Country and click on the Dreamland tab, and you'll find a link to his site from ours. Stephen Schwartz, one of those who is out there empowering us to rediscover the fact that our bodies don't begin inside and end with our skin. The body goes right on, all the way to the edge of the universe and beyond into other universes. In fact, your body is as large as you want it to be. Your ability to detect the world around you is as expansive as you want it to be. It's up to you. Now let's go on with a little bit more about the psychic archaeology. I was fascinated by the Asawaki story because now this folks, Mr. Asawaki was
Sovietsky.
Well, I'm going
to Sovietsky.
Sowiecki was a Polish clairvoyant who lived in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century, was eventually murdered by Adolf Hitler. But what fascinates me is, bizarrely enough, I know or knew, she's since died, a woman who worked with him before the war in Poland.
Really?
Yes, quite surprisingly, and who said...
What did she say?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what she said. She said, "We achieved miracles, but we pushed away the dark side, and suddenly it came rushing toward us out of the west in the form of these men in black uniforms with their arms raised, encased in steel and spitting death." That's essentially what she said. It's not quite a quote.
Wow.
And she warned me. She said, "You will go down this same road in your life, but you must never forget your service to the dark side." And the question you must ask yourself every day is, how do you serve the dark side in a way that is positive and productive? How do you not allow it to turn into to evil, or not force it to turn into evil? Now, so I know a certain amount about him and about what he was doing, but why don't you tell us from the book a little bit of his remarkable story?
Well, Sowiecki is, he really is one of the more extraordinary people that I have come across. He was a Pole by ethnic heritage who was born in St. Petersburg to a fairly prominent, wealthy, sort of professional class family. And he was educated in a cadet school and became a chemical engineer. And when he was a young man, and when he was a young cadet, he would do strange things. He could know the answers to all the quizzes. And then once when he was a young man, he went to a small Russian town where he had to change trains. And he asked the station master if there was anything that was worth seeing, and the station master said there was a statue and there was a Jewish mystic. So he elected for the mystic and went down there, and he walked in, and he says, this man whose name was Vrobel told him the whole history of his life, including how he would die, and told him who he would become, what he would do, what he needed to do, and it changed his life. From that point on, he was a different person.
And there's a lesson in this, folks, if I just may interrupt for a second.
Sure.
Moments like this come into your life all the time. Following the soul's path, it takes intuition, but it also takes noticing where the wind seems to be blowing you. Often that wind that's blowing you is the wind of your life plan. Don't forget it. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, that's why it's important to be in the now, so that
right.
you can hear that or feel that in your metaphor. Yes, I agree. Anyway, well, he became a different person. He had this epiphany experience, and he became a different person. He went on to become a chemical engineer, and in 1918, at the end of the war, Poland became a country again. It wasn't a country when he was a boy. It had been taken over and become a province of Russia, and so he Poland became a nation again. And he went to Warsaw, and he practiced chemical engineering, and he was very social, and he had extraordinary abilities, and he used them exactly as the woman that you were saying. He used them in the service of good, and he was very well known. He became a kind of national hero, roughly in a way, sort of like a Polish Edgar Cayce. And people came to him from all over Europe, and particularly scientists, partly because he was a scientist by training, or a chemical engineer. And he particularly worked with a man named Claude Richet, who was the Nobel laureate, a French physician and scientist who won the Nobel Prize in 1913. And then he worked with a variety of other people. And then just before the war began, the Second War, he became friendly with a man named Poniatowski, who was the leading ethnographer, the leading archaeologist of Poland, who was very interested in early man sites in Poland. And they started doing a series of experiments where they would give Osowiecki an artifact, and he would describe where it came from, and very typical remote viewing. He would give two kinds of information: sense impressions, that is, what do things smell like, taste like, touch, or a kind of knowingness. He had he describing what these people were like. And to give you what struck me about it, Whitley, that I've never really, this is so extraordinary. What really makes these experiments as important is not only the caliber of the people that were involved, but as they began just before the war. And after Warsaw was occupied, the Nazis said anybody who practiced archaeology would be killed. And they actually did kill people. They went in one instance, into a church and took out the bride and groom, who was an archaeologist they found was actually doing some research, and they put the whole wedding party up against a wall and machine gunned them. So, it was dangerous. And you have this extraordinary series of what then becomes this extraordinary series of 39 experiments, where they literally would, these former professors, or they were professors, but the universities had been closed, they would break into their own museums to steal the artifacts, to take them to Osowiecki, to do these experiments to reconstruct Polish prehistory. And when Osowiecki, when the Warsaw Uprising occurred, he had to leave his apartment because they were setting things on fire. The city rose up against the Nazis. It was a ghastly. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed and burned. It was just awful. And he had to leave his apartment, and he took two things. He took a book he had written, and he took these experiments. That's how important these people thought they were. And so when I heard about them, they were this sort of legendary experiments. And then one day his widow was walking down the street, and a shabby man came up to her and said to her, "You are Madame Osowiecki?" And she said, "Yes." This is after the war, long after the war. And he said, "And your husband was Stephan Osowiecki?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "And he did archaeological experiments?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "I can get those experiments for you." And the deal that they struck was that he would not be turned in, that Mrs. Osowiecki felt that it was more important that the experiments be preserved, for which her husband and Poniatowski and these other scientists ultimately gave their lives. They got caught and sent to concentration camps. And so we got the experiments back, and I got hold of them and translated them. I had an extraordinary Polish freedom fighter, Andrew Nowina-Sapinski, who translated them for me, a guy who had fought in the uprising. It was an amazing experience just to go through at a personal level. And it revealed these extraordinary experiments where Osowiecki would go back in early Polish history and describe the lives of the people, things that were veridical, like the kind of hairdos they had,
Yes.
the kind of clothing they wore, the way they built their houses, much of which at the time contradicted what was known, but it has all turned out to be right.
All turned out to be right. Extraordinary. It's just amazing. As you go through the book, you just one thing after another, and you realize that he was seeing the past as it really was. Now, tell us about Watchers and who they are and what the mechanism appears to be that makes this possible.
Watchers in the context of the book?
In the context of your book, you mentioned the Watchers.
Oh, the Watchers are the people that's in the Bly Bond chapter. Those are the people who were the monks that were. Well, I think what I would say is this.
But do you think that, in other words, I know they were in the Bly Bond chapter, but my impression is that there is somebody out there that actually helps us when we try to do this.
Well, I will tell you my take on it now, after 35 years of doing this research and 35 years as a meditator. So I'm a person who has been involved in a very deep spiritual pilgrimage, and who is also, my principal area of interest is how individuals and small groups change the course of history. And the archaeological stuff is a way of studying consciousness in a vertical way. The same thing that impressed you. I mean, the stuff's either there or it's not there. You know, you cut through all the crap.
That's the beauty
very hard to argue
of it.
with
Yeah,
somebody.
You just cut through the crap because either you dig and it's there or it's not.
Or it's not there. Right. And I mean, end of story. So that's why I got interested in it. Where I am with this now is that I think that this is an utterly normal ability. I think remote viewing is one of many disciplines, most of which are couched in religious terms because they developed at a pre-industrial time when the only way people could think about this kind of awareness was in religious terms, and that all consciousness is interconnected and interdependent, and that energy fields, for want of a better term, and I acknowledge that's a hand waving, but that not energy field. Let's not say energy fields, because energy means something specific in science. Fields are created by thousands and thousands of reiterated acts of individual intention. And so, in a sense, we're creating the Watchers, in a way. It is the collective, think of it as the cosmic internet, and we are all workstations on the cosmic internet. That from single-celled organisms to high-order mammals, all living organisms. Part of what it means to be alive is that you are linked up. All life is interdependent and interconnected. And there's all kinds of research that's being done now, not just the stuff like the therapeutic intent, but there are entanglement studies that are being published in the physics journals about entanglement of large species like birds or fish who move all as one, or ants. There's in all kinds of areas of science, there are breakthroughs occurring which support this idea of consciousness being interconnected and interdependent. And remote viewing is one of the ways you get at that. And in these fields that are created, we create and add to, and they may have independent existence as well in this timeless, spaceless consciousness. There are energies. It's hard to talk about this because you've got to get the words right. There are fields of beneficence that are trying to help us.
Right.
That you can make yourself resonant with the accumulated good intentions. And conversely, by the way, if you watch what happens to major people who put themselves forward as spiritual leaders, if there is a difference between the public persona that they present and the private individual, that is who they really are, the energy that is focused on the public persona, which is this perfect being, right? If there is a variance between who you claim to be as a public figure and who you are in your private person, the dissonance that is set up by the energy that is, or the consciousness that is focused on you, will tear you apart. And you look at, the stories are endless of religious leaders who turned out to have these profound flaws, and they just go crazy in a certain way.
And will tear their followers apart as well. The
Absolutely.
whole thing. It never works.
Yeah, I mean, but you see this kind of pulsing of this field of intention. Intention, I think, is time-space is the longitude and latitude of the will. This is the realm of the will, where you get to see things played out. You have a here or a there, or you have a then or a now, and it's the longitude and latitude of experience. And as you express intention, things happen, and you live with the consequences of it. It's what in the East they would call karma. It's not a thing. It's like a memory of a pattern, a remembered daydream that you feel, and sometimes they become very compulsive, and people are compelled to do them. One of the things that we know from this kind of research is that it's a function of focus, and you can get to that focus either neurotically, becoming obsessed about something, or you can develop it quite volitionally as a consciously assumed discipline.
We have come to the end of our time together, I'm sorry to say, but that's a good note on which to end our experience with Stephen Schwartz on Dreamland. His book, The Secret Vaults of Time, Psychic Archaeology and the Quest for Man's Beginning, just one of Stephen's many works. You can explore his other works at Stephan A. Schwartz, that's StephanAschwartz.com, plus the Gold Standard remote viewing course, the Gold Standard. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. This week, she continues her discussion with Dr. Bruce Maccabee about the hidden realities behind Project Blue Book. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Back in early 1986, physicist Bruce Maccabee listened to United States Air Force geophysicist talk about the real Project Blue Book. Hawk's old friend, United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Bob Hippler, was living and working in two worlds, one real and the other phony. Colonel Hippler was trying to find a university willing to investigate UFOs for the United States Air Force. Dr. Maccabee concluded that Hippler was part of the government cover-up, quote, searching for patsies who would be willing to officially come up with the answer the Air Force wanted, unquote. And what the Air Force wanted was a whitewash that would say there was nothing to UFOs so the public and media would leave them alone. At the same time, Hippler emphasized to Hawk that there were two Project Blue Books, and Hippler worked for the real one, probably the MJ-12 group that knew the Earth was dealing with real extraterrestrial biological entities and their very advanced technologies, facts that MJ-12 decided were better kept to them in the interest of national security while they tried to back-engineer whatever ET technology they retrieved from crashes and tried to figure out what the ETs wanted. Back in 1986, Dr. Maccabee talked to UFO researcher author William Moore about the Hawk interview and Bob Hippler's revelation. Moore tracked Hippler down by phone, but all the real Project Blue Book investigator said was, it happened a long time ago, he didn't want to talk about it, goodbye, and click, hung up the phone. Hawk told Dr. Maccabee about autopsies that had been done on extraterrestrial biological entities and the terror that military security guards have had and probably still have about night duty at Area 51, Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and other sensitive American military installations. The reason for their terror? The appearance of lights in the sky and security guards who disappeared but never returned.
Hawk is talking about guards at these areas south of where you live, in Albuquerque, the McCormick Ranch and all that.
Right.
And the guards at the areas near Nellis Air Force Base, where he was stationed to do monitoring nuclear tests.
Right.
And he found out that the guards there the guards in these installations were afraid of staying out at night.
Why were they so afraid?
Well, apparently they had seen lights in the sky and other things, and to be completely explicit about it, according to Hawk, guards had disappeared. When they spent a night over in some of these areas, they just weren't found the next day. Now, how accurate this is, I don't know. This is what Hawk presumably was told by other guards who were there.
But talk about at least some of the details that Hawk told you that he understood about autopsies of what were called extraterrestrial biological entities, and some of the details that he was told were learned in those autopsies about non-humans.
The Navy doctors, Hawk was told, had 24 degrees between the three of them. The question was, why do they need that many degrees? And the answer was that they study humanoids. The implication being these are not human beings, but of human shape. And they also had some Army doctors acting as advisors to the Navy doctors. So, according to Bob Hippler, what Hippler supposedly told to Hawk was that Hippler had been shown pictures of 3 whole bodies and bits and pieces of others. 3 bodies were at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and doctors doing the autopsies were astounded. There was no esophagus, no stomach, and no reproductive system. The blood wasn't green, but it was somehow different. And they were on the order of 4 foot 8 inches to 5 foot 2 inches tall. In other words, about 5 feet, had tiny features and tiny bone structure. Their eyes were more slanted than ours, more like Oriental. And they had long fingers and tiny hands. From Hawk's testimony, if it is absolutely correct, he has indicated that there has been a major cover-up from back in the 50s at the very least, and it's wide and deep, involving things that we've heard about in recent years, and autopsies of aliens and so on. I think a lot of what Hawk said had never been said before. As 20 years ago, it had never been said before, and a lot of it is still unknown to most people. The history of this real Project Blue Book and so on, and also things that we haven't gotten into yet that he was told by a guy by the name of Dale Graff, who was in the Defense Intelligence Agency. I get the impression that there are a number of secret agencies of the U.S. government involved, had people involved. Well, they treated this subject as if they could talk about it because it wasn't real. Mm-hmm. I asked Hawk, why aren't you breaking security regulations or something like that by talking about this stuff? And he says, well, you've been told that these things never happened, and so it was okay to talk about them.
And that they didn't exist, and therefore, how could you classify something that didn't exist?
Right. Now, they've established a tradition that there's nothing to flying saucer reports. That tradition was established way back in 1947, and they've stuck to it. But they suddenly switch to saying, well, they are real, would swamp the government with people asking questions, and, what do we do about it, and what are they doing here? Questions that may not be answerable yet. We don't know. But it was a lie. The policy has always been a lie. And then the question is, why such a serious lie for so long? Well, it could be that the information that they're covering up, they figure it would be extremely detrimental to a civilization if they released it. The other alternative is that they don't know what's going on, and they don't want to admit it. As I said, they've established a tradition that there's nothing to it, and they're just plain going to stick to it. They try to keep their heads buried in the sand as long as they can. Now, what role did Dale Graff from the Defense Intelligence Agency play in this period that you've talked with Hawk about? Well, I'm not quite sure what his role was. Certainly he told Hawk quite a few things about Air Force, I guess, or military activities with respect to aliens and craft. But Dale Graff was plugged strongly into the remote viewing stuff. Mm-hmm. There's an intersection here between way out stuff in UFOs and way out stuff in beyond normal mental capabilities. The RV guys started up in the middle 70s. We're talking about Puthoff and Targ, who got a contract from the CIA to do work at the Stanford Research Institute, at least if I'm recalling correctly, to investigate the possibility of remote viewing. And to their great surprise, from what I've read, some of the remote viewers came up with flying saucers. In other words, they remotely viewed flying saucers. I personally knew one guy, Eldon Bird. Eldon became world famous for an experiment he did with Uri Geller, using a metal called nitinol, nickel titanium, invented at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, NITINOL. And that was a so-called memory metal. And according to Eldon Bird's description of what happened, Geller, by just rubbing the wire, changed its memory. Whereas in ordinary circumstances, you'd have to raise it to several hundred degrees centigrade, something like red hot or something, in order to do that. Geller was a deep believer in extraordinary mental powers, like RV, telekinesis, and so on. He happened to work at the Naval Surface Warfare Center, where I worked at the time. That's how I happened to happened to meet him. From the RV point of view, you had these RV guys remotely viewing flying saucers, quite by accident often. And from the flying saucer side, we had these abductee reports where the abductees talked about hearing words in their head, but apparently coming from these creatures, but the creatures were not moving their lips and there was no sound involved. It's like direct communication into your brain. That sounds very much like some sort of telepathy or something, which is an extraordinary mental ability. So there seems to be a joining of effects here going on. And this guy, Dale Graff, was somehow plugged into both of them.
At this point, where you are professionally and having looked at so many UFO ET cases over the years, what is your personal perspective in 2006 about what the American government might do in terms of finally telling the truth about extraterrestrial biological entities and their technologies?
Well, I don't think the U.S. government is going to say anything until everything is out there somehow or other independently of the government. Then the government might admit that it knew all along. But I don't think they're going to do anything positive in terms of release of information on any official level.
Why?
Well, for one thing, I think it's this tradition situation. Another thing, I think that they realize that if they suddenly admit that it's all real, or some of it's real, they're going to be absolutely swamped. It'll almost shut the government down with all the questions that are going to be asked. And a third thing is they may say, well, the information is so unusual or horrendous or whatever that we're worried about civilization falling apart. We really can't afford to have that happen yet.
But isn't the
That depends on what sort of information they have.
Do you think that it is the hard physical evidence of phenomena such as worldwide animal mutilations and the human abduction syndrome that are largely keeping the government quiet, and their own culpability in attacking and then having retaliation of a technology that they cannot cope with?
Well, certainly if they said, well, it's all real and there's nothing we can do about it, this would be bad news for the governments. All governments. whether or not that is the situation, that they think that there's nothing they can do about it, I don't know. But like I said, I don't think they're going to say anything until the answer's out there, and then they might admit that they knew it all along. You have to understand that the number of people who are truly in the know is probably very small. Mm-hmm. Most of the government has suffered along with virtually everybody else with what I call a self-cover-up. Mm-hmm. This is subject has such huge import for human future that nobody really wants to know it's true. The admission that creatures are flying around out there doing whatever they're doing and we have no control over them amounts to a loss of control. So if this is a situation and the government knows that we have no control, the government itself realizes it would lose control of the situation if it were to admit that. And of course, it would have profound implications for our understanding of our place in the universe, and the history of the human race may well be different from what we think what we've been told. Science and religion and economics and all sorts of things would be severely impacted.
And complicating all of this is what emerges from so many people, whether it's military, intelligence, or the abduction syndrome, that there are more than one type, including the so-called blonde Nordics and reptilians and on and on. Therefore, if it is a mixed bag of multiple species with multiple agendas, and you were in the shoes of the president and this government, what would you do?
Give the shoes to somebody else.
Which is apparently what everybody's been trying to do decade after decade.
We're talking about something that's related to maybe the ethics of the creatures, of the ETs or whatever. The fact that they haven't just landed and sort of taken over may be an indication of their own ethics, that they realize that our society has grown up assuming that we're the only intelligent life around, and maybe the only intelligent life in the universe. To realize that we're not, and that other creatures around doing things that we can't do and we have no control over, would be a shock to our civilization, and it might fall apart. One thing I do worry about, of course, is whether the information that filters into the culture is an accurate portrayal of what these creatures really are.
Right.
It may be that we just don't know, and so that any portrayal at all might be better than none, or it could be that the portrayals we're giving are totally wrong, and that could be bad, but we just don't know.
Especially when I think back to a man who had worked in Washington, D.C. in a highly classified position, and he said, we're dealing with Earth's secret war. Mm-hmm. And if that Earth's secret war was going on in the 40s, the 50s, as Hawk knew, into the 60s, the 70s, and now perhaps even into the 21st century, what are the implications for our future in relationship to something that can mutilate animals worldwide using a beam technology that they can also apply on people?
Yep, I don't know. But like J. Allen Hynek said when asked, how do you live with this stuff? He says, I live with it every day as if it weren't real.
And that is the government's official position.
That's their official position. It isn't real. The big problem is you don't know what their goals are. So you don't necessarily know how to react.
Exactly.
Or what sort of a policy to formulate. If they all loved us, and we decide to form a policy of retaliation, we might turn them from friends into enemies. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if there are creatures out there slavering to eat us,
right.
and we formulate a policy of love, well, we might make a nice meal with no resistance at all. So, without knowing exactly what they're going to do, it's kind of hard to decide what sort of exopolitics to develop.
And that might be the reason why there has been such a strict American policy of denial for more than 60 years on a subject in which it's becoming very clear through leaked documents and people leaking like hawk that our government has a tremendous amount of knowledge about what they define as extraterrestrial biological entities, and they don't want the public and the media to have the facts because clearly they may still be confused about what the agendas are.
Yeah. If you go beyond Hawk and beyond Hawk and beyond autopsies of aliens, to the idea that there have been communications going on, the Holloman communication scenario, for example, or most recently the Serpo type of scenario.
An exchange to another planet.
An exchange, which is really about as far as you can go, I guess, or if you pick something like the Jacobs scenario of integration of ETs with humanity by hybridization. Any one of these situations are going to result in, well, you would assume that you would learn a lot about the aliens and what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, how long it's going to take them to get something done, whatever that amounts to, you know. And the problem there is we have very tenuous sources of information, like this guy, Anonymous, was telling us all about Serpo. What can you believe and what can you forget? What is believable and what isn't?
If we had an exchange program in which some humans from the United States went to another solar system, it's been described as being Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, and that some humans were there for a period of time and at least one came back to report, and that occurred beginning in 1964, why wouldn't all of that information have been given to the world after physical, hard proof evidence, unless there is something that disturbs our government?
Well, something about that information makes somebody in the government think that it's too hot to handle.
What do you think that could be?
Well, I suppose if they were to come out and say, we belong to them, you could ask, well, is this any different than religion? But it would really bring things home more because you have these creatures coming down, presumably, and abducting people, having direct interactions with their lives.
And that the reason might be...
We don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it.
But that the reason might be because there is an intimate historical relationship between those beings and the beings on this planet.
Yeah, that certainly is possible. And to admit to something like that would cause major shocks in our culture.
When I was growing up, my parents said always tell the truth. Lying only blows up in your face. And now, Whitley, I wonder if the government has been wrong to lie, even about a world-shocking truth.
Well, Linda, if the government is indeed lying, and I think we all know it is, in the sense that, I mean, in my case, it must be, because I've been face-to-face with the visitors. I spent 11 years with them in my life, and of course they were there. Whether they were from another planet or not, I still don't know. But nevertheless, my also personal and your personal and extensive contacts with intelligence officials, and in my case also congressional officials, convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that the government is hiding something. But here's the thing. So are they, whoever they are, they're hiding it too. They are very, very secretive. My efforts to get proof, documentary proof in any number of different forms, were intentionally circumvented routinely by them. They prevented that from happening. So, if anything, it's a mutual policy on the part of government as well as who or whatever is here.
What do you expect to happen in terms of if all of the truth came out? Do you think that the world could handle it now?
One of the interesting reports was from my own uncle, who was very negative. He was involved in the Roswell incident, as I've reported on in various occasions, specifically with attempting to reassemble the debris that was brought back to Wright Field. He said that the U.S. government had communicated with them in the early 50s, and that we had been told that if we revealed the secret, they would simply destroy the planet. General Art Exon, who I knew also, had a slightly different and more optimistic viewpoint. He said, and this dovetails with a statement made in Science magazine in April of 1977 by D.B.H. Cooper and Michael Morris, that they were withholding contact because it would refocus our whole culture toward them, and they were so far in advance of us that it would disempower us and ruin our own journey to higher levels of knowledge, just as what happened to many native peoples when Europeans or Americans with more advanced technology showed up. They ended up just abandoning their own cultures and becoming a bunch of drunks. They don't want that to happen to us, so they hide. I don't know which of those is true. There was also another story, and I'll just be very brief with this because we're running out of time. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. That was a fear that was elucidated first by Dr. John von Neumann, a early member of the Majestic Group and a very highly placed scientist and one of the early quantum physicists, who feared that if we admit that our not admitting that they were here was what was keeping them out of our reality, and if there was an official level of admission, that they would literally be able to come pouring into our world, which they are not presently willing to do. And he viewed all of the UFO sightings and the efforts that they make to be seen as a kind of military operation, very sinister. I wrote a short story about this called The Open Doors, which is available in our subscriber section for subscribers to read and download. But now I'd like to return it to you.
Well, one of the things listening to you talk about the possible options, one, that we could be dealing with another intelligence off planet that would actually threaten. Was it doing the threat that it would destroy this planet if the government opened up the truth, versus a off-planet intelligence so advanced and understanding the evolution that we're in baby steps in trying to stand up, and that they are not interfering? If the second were true, which is what we would all hope, it would never make a threat of destruction, and I can't imagine that a very, very advanced intelligence would ever do anything that was sinister and interact with the planet in, let's say, the calling cards of animal mutilations and human abductions as they have been described.
Well,
Therefore,
Linda,
I stand back and say it looks like such a mixed bag that it worries me.
Well, it worries me too. I do, however, think that the Greys would, in order to prevent us from hurting ourselves, they would make dire threats against the government. I do know that they do not like and find absurd, in fact, our governments. I have been intimately involved in their reaction to government and to our wars and so forth. I was heavily involved with them in ways I haven't discussed yet with regard to the first Gulf War and their complete disdain for everything that happened. Yes, they would make dire threats because they would fear that we would not be able to uphold our side of the bargain unless we were under dire threat. They don't have a very high opinion of our governing bodies. They consider them to be, frankly, trash. Well, now we have come to the end of our time together. Two things. First, we've never talked to Stephen Schwartz. And the second thing is, we have never talked about psychic archaeology, which is astonished me. In all the years I've been doing Dreamland, the subject's never come up. but it's going to come up today, and we're going on quite an extraordinary adventure into the world of psychic archaeology. But before we do that, I want to let you know a little bit about Stephen and his background. First of all, he is one of the most connected, best connected people in the world of remote viewing, and he's got a phenomenal course available. You can go to his website, StephanASchwartz.com. Stephen, have I got that correct?
That's right.
Stephan A. Schwartz, that's StephanASchwartz.com to get a look at this marvelous course. And I say marvelous because a number of people I know well, among them Dr. Hal Puthoff, are participants in this course. It's called the Gold Standard Course for a reason. Russell Targ is involved, Ingo Swan, all old friends, Skip Atwater, even Edgar Evans Casey is involved. It's 15 discs in 3 volumes. Tell us a little bit about it. Why don't you, Stephen, and let us know a little bit more about the course.
Well, I thought it had been almost 30 years since we had a small group of us had created remote viewing as a laboratory protocol. And in that time, it had gone from being this obscure lab protocol to a social movement. It was just amazing. I mean, we didn't anticipate any of that, but it's the first thing that has ever moved about consciousness that was testable, that you could objectively validate, and that most people could do. And so it has ballooned from a few hundred, a handful of people to a few hundred to now there's close to 1 million hits that come up if you do it with Google. So I thought it was time that those of us, and they're talking about the stuff that they actually did. It's none of it is secondhand. I talk about the social role of it, and I also talk about the archaeological work that I did and over the years.
Which is we're going to be talking about also later in the program. Now, you passed over something very quickly, James Spottiswood's research into sidereal time and its significance in regard to remote viewing. Let's talk a little bit more about that. That's a particularly fascinating subject because it's an important one that we know very little about.
Well, sidereal time is one of the influences that we know shape our ability to do this. This is a lawful ability. That is, it follows certain rules. We know, for instance, that meditation makes people better remote viewers, probably because it teaches them to focus. We also know that there are things in the biosphere, that is, changes in the environment of the planet that have an effect on all living organisms, and one of the effects is that it either improves or degrades remote viewing. We know that, for instance, when the geomagnetic field is weak and when things are quiet, that you do better than when it's not. We know that that there are certain times when it is better to do a remote viewing than others. Although I want to emphasize, these are slight changes. It's kind of like doing an aspirin study. That is, you can't tell about a single person if they took aspirin whether it made any difference. But if you look at a lot of people, you can see over that course of people that although this effect is small, it is pronounced. And that's what happened. Local sidereal time, I can't even, because nobody has any idea what causes it. We just know that if you do remote viewings at some times rather than others, that you get a better outcome.
So getting into the course then, what is it, I've been looking at the course on Amazon.com, folks, by the way, and it gets fabulous reviews, so people are liking it, and I'm always interested in this because remote viewing is something that you can do. It's anyone can do it. That's correct, isn't it, essentially, Stephen?
That's correct.
Anyway.
Let me define answer your question about local sidereal time.
Define sidereal time for us, by the way. That would be a good idea.
The ordinary 24-hour solar day is slightly longer than the sidereal day. It's because the revolution of the Earth around the sun in the same direction as the daily rotation of the Earth. And the Earth it rotates a little bit more to bring the sun back overhead from one noon to the next. So there's a slight differential in these two times and the chronological time that we work with. And we know that if you where you are on the planet makes a difference about what the local sidereal time is. You can calculate it by going to websites that are maintained by the Navy. That you can just do a Google on local sidereal time. It's SIDEREAL, and you can work out. You don't have to do any calculations. All the math is. You don't need any of that. You just go. The Navy maintains a site, and you put in where you are located, and it will tell you what your local sidereal time is. And the reason it matters is that at 1350, at 1:30 local sidereal time, an experiment's 5 times as likely to be successful as at other times, and at 1800 hours, which is 6 o'clock, an experiment is least likely to succeed. So it matters at what time you do it, but as I say, it's a small effect, and lots of very successful remote viewings have been done with no consideration to this at all. But if you want to be in a sort of optimal state, you want to be a meditator, you want to be a person who's in good health, does regular physical exercise, because we know that good health is also one of the determinants. You want to do this at a particular time, as I say, at about 1:30 local sidereal time, who had been involved in the creation of remote viewing, got together, and each spoke in the area that he had greatest expertise. And so I filmed them all, and it's like a PBS kind of program. And it's got 10 DVDs, which are Hal Puthoff talking about the CIA program, Russ Targ talking about quantum physics and consciousness. Ingo talks about what he's learned over the years, and James Spottiswoode talks about local sidereal time. Dale Graff talks about remote viewing and dreaming. Paul Smith talks about the Army experience. Skip talks about the Monroe work and remote viewing, and so you've got sort of the whole arc of the development of this whole area of research and human experience. And so put it together and then put 5 CDs which take you through the actual experiences, so that it's a head and heart sort of thing. You get a chance to get the intellectual material, the science, and then you get to actually get the art and have the experience of these abilities.
Because it's actually, these are the people who actually did this. In other words, it's not, there's so much junk out there with remote viewing courses. I mean, it's a load of baloney.
That's what part of the reason I did it. This is, if you want to know what the CIA actually did in terms of the SRI, Stargate, all of that, there's nobody better than Hal Puthoff. He was the director of the lab when it was going on. If you want to know what's the real truth about local sidereal time and its effect on remote viewing performance or geomagnetic field strength, and there's nobody better than James Spottiswoode. He was the one who did the original research that led to understanding that. If you want to talk about the Army, Paul Smith was the commanding officer. I mean, you can't get better than that.
Yeah, the commanding officer, not some sergeant who happened to be there in the background.
Yeah, I mean, these are the actual guys, and you want to do it when the geomagnetic field strength is weak and solar activity is low, and that will give you, from the point of view of the viewer, that'll give you the greatest opportunity that you'll be able to obtain information from the future or from distant locations.
Well, it's most interesting in any case, and I'm very glad to see that the course is available, because it is, and even in the reviews on Amazon, people mention how disappointed they've been in the past with these courses that don't work, and they simply don't work. I was very fortunate to be taught this in such a way that come to use it constantly in my everyday life, and I find myself using it so frequently. For example, if I'm drive around a lot in California and it's a lot of traffic, and I can easily remote view ahead to see what the traffic just is by just looking down at the highway. It becomes I know that sounds wild, but it's extremely effective, and it's never wrong. I never even think about it. It's just like seeing through my regular eyes at this point.
That's the point. This is a normal human ability.
Exactly.
You're not getting anything. You already have this. It's about learning how to open yourself to this level of this source of information. And once you've got it, it's just as you're saying, you do it. It's like second nature. Oh, I wonder what the traffic's going to be like 2 miles ahead. It's
exactly.
You just do it.
You do it, or in the case like right now, as I'm sitting here and I see Anne I'm in my studio. The door is closed. Anne is in the next room. She's sitting at a round table. I know the table well, of course. And she's reading a newspaper. And if I walk out there, I know that's exactly what I will see. And
okay.
So
you are one of those people who is already working with this aspect of himself.
Well, I've taken a course in remote viewing, a very good course, in fact. Not your course. It didn't exist then. This was about 10 years ago.